The Keeper of the Lost, a synthesis project by Ife Barrett. Aurashala was unaware of her abilities until the Ghostmen arrived and imposed their ways on her village. She was only 9 years old when they arrived, and she watched hopelessly for 3 years as things fell apart. Before she could realize the true motives of the Ghostmen, her people had already succumbed to the spirit of defeat. The spirit guide, Eshe, a woman who swore to be over 200 years old, visited her father in a dream and showed him the destiny of their people. Eshe showed him visions of their people packed as cargo on the large vessels that floated on water. She showed them unspeakable images of their people. He saw the division, the loss of culture, and to him it was unfathomable. The fierce warrior king that he was, he could not imagine a life outside of his culture. He saw the contention that they caused among his tribesmen already. In his subconscious mind, a switch was activated: fight or flight. Normally, he would have chosen to fight. He killed a lion with his bare hands at the age of 14. Fighting was easy. It was what came naturally. However, this was different. He had displeased the gods. The night was dark, but the flashes of lightning illuminated the village. Water gushed from the sky like the waterfall where Aurashala bathed with her mother's sisters and her father's wives and other children. However, she could see everything as though it were clear and sunny day. Aurashala stood by in horror and watched her father first, and then her entire village as they silently marched to the shore in a trance, heads held high in defiance. It was as though they had moved as one force: women, men, children, her friends and family. No one felt her nails claw at their skin. No one heard her cries of protest. After her unsuccessful attempts at saving her people, she dropped to her knees, frozen in shock. With the last flash of lightning, she saw their bodies enveloped by the sea. Why hadn't she gone with them? Why hadn't she fallen into the same trance? Even Eshe walked into the water to her death. What was she to do now that her people had left? Something happened to Aure. As she knelt at the shore, alone in the dark, it was as though she could hear the final thoughts of every child in her village all at once. A wave crashed and the water surrounded her before it quickly receded. The first contact with the salty water, it was warm. It sent a shock through her body. She didn't realize it, but the traumatic events mixed with the fear was the catalyst for her change. Her need for her people was too strong. She didn't want to lose them. They were as important to her as they were to her father. The spirits of the children were confused and did not fully want to walk into the water to their deaths. The second wave crashed, and Aure felt a second shock. Waves of salt water crashed over her body for hours until she drew the spirit of every child inside of her, even the spirits of unborn children. She wasn't sure how long she stood at the beach receiving souls into her own body, but when she came to, she was already in shackles. She heard a voice in her head: "Keep your peace, Aure." It was Eshe. How was it Eshe? A man came, one of the Ghostmen. He was large, old, and unshaven. He had a lecherous gaze. He locked eyes with young Oray. She shut her eyes tight to avoid contact. She didn't want to know what he was about to do. She opened her mouth to scream, and she felt him jam a hard object into her mouth, a piece of wood. Unfamiliar, callous hands felt like branding irons searing into the flesh of her wrists. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head. Hot colors flashed behind her eyelids. Black, red, flickers of yellow, then white. She was no longer on the ship. Array didn't fully understand her powers. She didn't understand how to control them. She didn't realize that she had bit into the wood, a piece of redwood that the ghostman had from his last voyage to a land where big trees grew. Her brain cells had communicated with the remnants of life in the wood that was shoved into her mouth. Her fear caused a chemical reaction with the spirits she had consumed at the shore. The children spirits of her village teleported her to a redwood forest, and she morphed into a giant redwood. Array didn't realize that she spent 200 years as a giant redwood. She woke up to her name being whispered among the leaves of the other redwoods. Horatiola, Horatiola, Horatiola. The other redwoods were very old. They only spoke wise words. The redwoods spoke to other trees from faraway lands. Their words were carried by the wind in their leaves. They told stories of what the oddities, or the humans, were doing. The oddities have cut us down, and their axes. The oddities have cut us down with their axes and built boats and cities. Boats and cities. Boats and cities. She heard them whisper. She heard several repeated whispers, because this was how the redwood spoke. She's awake. She's awake. She's awake. She has awoken. She has awoken. She heard whispered several times around her. Will you exist as a giant tree, or will you return to your natural state? She heard whispered. Natural state, natural state, natural state. She heard the echo. Suddenly, she became aware of her enormous, majestic presence. Her bark, her enormous high branches, the xylem and phloem cells in her anatomy, carrying water and nutrients from the soil and out of her body. She felt herself photosynthesizing, creating her own sugars. Food! It was exhilarating and it was terrifying. She began to panic, a suppressed memory of a little girl touching her bark 4 years prior while she was still asleep, quote unquote. She could feel pressure in her roots and leaves. The cells inside of her seemed to be drawing an enormous amount of water from the soil in which her roots had been intensely planted. She felt a sharp burst of energy from the sun. Millions of spheres of light were absorbed by her leaves. She was transforming again. When Array's eyes opened, she was at a river, staring at the image of an 8-year-old Cheyenne girl in the water. It was her reflection. She had become the image of the little girl who touched her bark when she was a redwood. A woman took her hand and led her away. Array read her mind quickly. She was a woman she could trust. She was her mother. Wait! When did she start to scan people's thoughts? She looked up at the trees, but she couldn't hear them. She was listening to her mother speak in her dialect. Somehow, she understood. She and her siblings would have to go to school with the white children. Life would be better for them if they learned the ways of the white people. Array wasn't sure what she meant by white people, so she scanned her mother's mind. To her horror, memories she had suppressed for 200 years came forward. It was the ghost men. And then Eshe again. The last time I told you to keep your peace and you morphed into a giant tree for 200 years already. Do not do that again, no. I cannot reach your mind in the botanical form. I am not of my physical body anymore. I am just a spirit who can communicate with your mind. You must learn your purpose, Ore. Learn to use your powers and listen to your physical mother. I am responsible for programming the tribe to walk into the water. I cannot see my people lost in the slave trade. When I sent the signal to your father, he sent it to the people, but you did not receive the signal to walk into the water. I could not connect with you to the web that I created to collect our people. This was not for our people to endure, but many others are suffering at the hands of the ghost men. Go to their schools as your mother has asked you to do. Do not. If you do not like the way they are being treated, use your powers wisely. You will see the limitations of your powers, but you must learn to control them. And Eshe was gone. The mother of her current body was calling her name. Sequoia, she said with urgency. Sequoia! It wasn't her first time calling her, but it was Aray's first time hearing it. She took her mother's hand and went home to prepare for her trip with the white people. Aray tried not to read her mother's thoughts because they were not very pleasant. She learned that the people of her current body were called Cheyenne. They had a pilgrimage out of a land called Colorado, and there was a massacre in the year 1864 that resulted in the loss of her tribe. It was starting to feel familiar, Aray thought sadly. The white woman and man, Mr. and Mrs. Prattle, that took them to school seemed nice, but they were very strange. They dressed very strange, and their hair and appearance was very different. Aray preferred the garbs of Sequoia people. It was more like that of her original people, with the feathers and animal hide. However, Miss Prattle said that she should wear the garb of a white girl, a ghost girl. Aray scanned the mind of Mrs. Prattle. She thought Sequoia's people were savages, but she would rather civilize and educate them by immersing them in white culture than to murder them. As a Christian, that was her religion. She was doing the right thing. This was crazy, Aray thought. She learned the ways of the white people, and she and her siblings were transformed from Cheyenne children to white children. It didn't feel right to the body of Sequoia. Sequoia's mind felt sorrow because she felt she missed her mother. Mrs. Prattle and her husband were telling them that it was bad to be Cheyenne. The worst part of it was when they held her down and cut her long hair. She thought her mother had died, gone back home, and that was the reason they were doing it. She screamed, "Ah!" and struggled, but she was no match for the man that Mrs. Prattle had employed to restrain her. She heard the voice of Eshe. Use your powers wisely. Aray shut her eyes. Her mind communicated with that of a little white boy who she was playing with in the fields earlier that morning. The black, the red, the yellow flickers of light formed a white stream of energy. She followed it until it drew her into the body of the little white boy. She was in a classroom. A woman had just set a bowl of sliced apples, cheese, bread, and butter in front of her. There was a man standing in the front of the room giving instructions. The woman brought over a tin cup of milk. Array was appalled by this. Her people thought it was an abomination to drink the milk of other animals. She was starving. She ate the apples and bread. Somehow she understood that she should raise her hand and request water. The teacher was happy to grant her request. She drank a lot of water until she had to use the outhouses. That's when she remembered that she was a little white boy. As a little white boy, her experience in school was far more pleasant than that of Sequoia. She learned that her name was Michael, and she was 9 years old. It had come to her in that instant that she could only transform into a child. That was the limitation of her powers. She could only develop into an adult in her botanical form. She liked school as Michael because she received a lot of praise for memorizing and repeating information that the teacher wanted her to know. She was good at memorizing with her new powers, and she only had to read the mind of the teacher to provide the answer that she was looking for. Ray enjoyed the feeling of being a genius and basked in the praise that she received. Her teacher, Mr. Bolton, received a great deal of praise as well for raising a brilliant pupil like Michael, who was apparently from a poor white family who had somehow finagled an education. Mr. Bolton saw Michael as his creation. He was a receptacle that he filled with a great deal of important information. When Array scanned the mind of Mr. Bolton and realized his beliefs, she became bored with their relationship. Eshe came to her. "You are rather comfortable as a ghost boy, eh?" "Shut up, old woman. You are the reason that I am lost wandering this strange land."